At this moment, while most of England still slept, while the coastal towns held their breath in the gray pre-dawn darkness, a 24-year-old woman named Elizabeth Carter was already awake. She had been awake since 3:10 in the morning, hunched over a workbench in Hangar 2, checking the Merlin engines that would soon power the last line of defense between German bombers and the airfield beneath her feet. She could hear them before anyone else could, the rising scream of the Jericho trumpets, the mechanical sirens bolted onto the wings of the Stukas, engineered for one purpose and one purpose only, to freeze every living thing beneath them with pure, primal terror. The vibration hit the hangars before the bombers even appeared on the horizon. It was a frequency she had memorized the way other people memorize songs, the way mothers memorized their children's cries. Lizzie Carter had learned to recognize that sound because she had been listening to it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of raids. 3 weeks of watching German dive bombers tear through the sky above this airfield, and 3 weeks of watching the RAF's anti-aircraft guns jam at precisely the moment they mattered most. She looked up from the carburetor she had been cleaning. Around her, technicians turned their heads in unison. Pilots who had been walking toward the dispersal areas suddenly broke into a sprint. Ground crews shouted bearing coordinates and wind readings to one another, their voices cracking with the kind of urgency that comes from knowing you have less than 10 minutes. In less than 9 minutes, RAF Northweald would be under the heaviest Luftwaffe assault since the start of the Battle of Britain. But Elizabeth Carter did not run, not yet. She stood perfectly still and counted the shadows crossing the estuary. Not 3 bombers, not 7, more than 20. She counted each one individually, the way she counted mechanical tolerances, precisely, without emotion, without error. RAF observers would later confirm 20 Heinkel bombers and nearly the same number of Bf-109 fighters forming escort patterns above the water. But Lizzie did not need a report from observers. She felt the numbers in her bones. She had watched this pattern repeat itself for weeks. She knew the mathematics of it. The Germans were becoming more aggressive, more coordinated, more lethal. She set down her tools and began walking, not toward the shelter, not toward the command bunker, but toward the anti-aircraft pits on the southwest corner of the airfield, where she had spent the last 3 weeks studying something no one had authorized her to study: the guns, the ones that jammed. Over the past 21 days, she had timed every single malfunction. She had written down every failure in a grease-stained notebook that she kept tucked beneath her uniform. 17 to 19 rounds before the feed arms stuck. 12 to 14 seconds to clear the jam. A jam every cycle. A catastrophe during a mass raid. She had told the gunners about the pattern. They had laughed at her, a woman with no weapons training, no authority, no right to speak about guns at all. She had told the engineering staff. They had smiled politely and told her to focus on engines, which is what women mechanics did. They fixed engines. They did not solve weapons problems. They did not design solutions that challenged the very men who were supposed to be protecting them. She had even told the commanding officer. He had listened to her with the kind of patience men in 1940 reserved for children and women asking foolish questions. Then he had walked away, and nothing had changed. The guns had kept jamming. Men had kept dying. But Lizzie Carter had kept watching. Because in those 3 weeks of observation, she had noticed something that everyone else had missed. A detail so small that most people would never see it. 2 millimeters. That was the difference between a clean rotation and a catastrophic jam. 2 millimeters of deviation in the feed arm assembly. 2 millimeters was all it took for the mechanism to bind up, to seize, to become useless at the exact moment when lives depended on it functioning perfectly. And 2 millimeters was something a woman with hands and a file and 21 nights of stolen hours could fix. The first bombs hit the south side of the base at 5:44 in the morning. The shockwave blew grit across the flight line. Half-assembled Hurricanes shuddered like animals waiting for slaughter. The metal hangar walls buckled inward and sprang back out again, groaning under the force of the detonations. Someone shouted for ammunition. Someone else screamed that radar had reported another wave forming behind the first. Officers barked orders that were swallowed by the sound of explosions. Elizabeth Carter kept walking. Through the chaos, through the collapsing scaffolds and buckling sheet metal, through the smoke that was already beginning to rise from the fuel depot. She was heading toward a specific location, the anti-aircraft pit where she had hidden something under a tarp on the night before. Something she had built with her own hands. Something that the men around her had called a toy, a waste of time, an impossible dream built by a woman who did not understand the limits of what could be done with scrap metal and determination. She reached the pit at 5:46 in the morning. The ground shook beneath her feet. Dust rained from the metal supports overhead. A corporal looked at her as if she were mad as she approached the tarp-covered shape on the firing stand. She ignored his expression. She had stopped caring about what men thought of her the moment she decided to file metal by hand at 3 in the morning while the rest of the base slept. She grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled it back, revealing what lay beneath. A machine barely 20 kilograms in weight, a multi-barrel rotary gun. A weapon constructed entirely from scrap, hydraulic tubing from damaged Merlin engines, a central rod salvaged from an aircraft crankshaft, a firing mechanism built from bicycle parts and salvaged springs, a weapon that no one had authorized, a weapon that everyone had dismissed, a weapon that was about to prove them all wrong. She spun the barrels with her hand. The rotation was smooth, perfect. The alignment she had filed by feel, night after night, still held precisely true. She checked the feed path, clean. She checked the recoil brace, tight. She checked her ammunition belts, loaded with rounds she had hand-cleaned one by one to avoid microburrs that could jam the mechanism. She had done all of this because she knew with absolute certainty that the battle that would prove her right was coming. And it was coming right now. To understand what Elizabeth Carter did in those 14 minutes of combat, you must first understand what drove her to build the weapon in the first place. It began not with inspiration, but with observation, with counting, with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that is either born into a person or beaten into them by circumstance. In her case, it was both. She had joined RAF Northweald in early July 1940, just as the Battle of Britain was reaching its most brutal intensity. She came as a mechanic, one of the few women the Air Ministry had grudgingly accepted into the maintenance crews, not because they believed women could fix engines, but because there were not enough men left alive to do the work. The men were all in the air, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes against the Luftwaffe. The men were dying, so the RAF opened the hangars to women, and Elizabeth Carter walked in knowing exactly what she was doing. She had been building and repairing engines since she was 14 years old. Her father had been a mechanical engineer. Her mother had been a mathematician. She had inherited her father's hands and her mother's mind, a combination that made her dangerous in ways that most people did not yet understand. For the first 2 weeks at Northweald, she did what she was assigned to do. She checked carburetors. She cleaned fuel injectors. She calibrated ignition systems. She earned the grudging respect of her fellow technicians through the sheer quality of her work. But she was also watching, always watching. She watched the Hurricanes come back from patrol with bullet holes through their fuselages and wings. She watched the ground crews patch those holes with sheet metal and hope. She watched the Spitfires take off with full ammunition belts and come back with empty ones, their pilots climbing down with shaking hands and haunted eyes. And she watched the anti-aircraft guns. There were 3 main pits defending RAF Northweald. Each one was equipped with QF 3-inch guns, heavy, powerful, theoretically capable of bringing down German bombers if they performed as designed. But they were not performing as designed. They were jamming, constantly, repeatedly, in patterns so consistent that Lizzie could predict when the next jam would occur with almost perfect accuracy. On July 24th, during a routine gun drill, she stood 50 meters away and timed the malfunction with nothing but a pocket watch and her own internal count. 18 rounds before the feed arm stuck, 13 seconds to clear the jam, 4 seconds to reload, 2 seconds to aim. That meant 19 seconds of complete vulnerability. 19 seconds during which a German dive bomber could drop a full bomb load on the fuel depot, or the control tower, or the concentrated mass of aircraft parked in the dispersal areas. 19 seconds. That was the margin of error between life and death. She began keeping a notebook, small, leather-bound, easily concealed. In it, she recorded every jam, every malfunction, every second of downtime. She sketched the feed mechanism from memory. She drew diagrams of how the ammunition belt fed into the rotating mechanism. She noted the precise angle at which the belt needed to be aligned to function smoothly. And she identified the problem. 2 millimeters. That was all. A simple deviation in the feed arm assembly, 2 millimeters off from perfect alignment, and the entire mechanism would bind. The belt would kink. The rotation would hesitate. The jam would happen. 2 millimeters. A measurement so small that most people would never notice it. But Elizabeth Carter had spent her entire life noticing things that small. She had spent years learning to file metal to tolerances of fractions of a millimeter. She understood viscerally, in her hands and in her bones, that the difference between success and failure often came down to measurements so small they were almost invisible. On July 24th, during a routine gun drill, she approached the engineering officer in charge of the anti-aircraft guns. She showed him her notebook. She explained the pattern. She proposed a solution. Adjust the feed arm assembly by precisely 2 millimeters and the jams would stop. The officer looked at her notebook, then he looked at her, then he carefully closed the notebook and handed it back to her. Mechanic Carter, I appreciate the observation, but the guns are performing within acceptable parameters according to the specifications. The issue is not the guns. The issue is the operators. They need better training, better discipline. She understood what he was really saying. A woman does not tell men how to fix weapons, even if she is right. She left his office and walked directly to the workshop. That night, at 3:10 in the morning on August 4th, she began her first experiment. She had access to the scrap pile behind Hangar 3, aircraft that had been damaged beyond repair, engines that had seized, fuselages that had been torn apart by cannon fire. And among that wreckage, materials, resources, the raw components of something new. She selected 6 pieces of aircraft-grade hydraulic tubing. Each one measured nearly 1 meter in length. The alloy strength far exceeded anything a standard infantry barrel could tolerate. These tubes had been designed to withstand enormous hydraulic pressures. They could certainly withstand the forces of a rotating firing mechanism. Over the next week, she machined those tubes on the lathe during the hours when the workshop was empty, after the day crews had gone, before the night shift arrived. In that narrow window of opportunity, she shaved each tube until it weighed less than 2 pounds. She aligned them around a central rod, a piece scavenged from a damaged Merlin crankshaft, a component designed to endure the most violent mechanical stresses imaginable. She mounted the rods inside a rotational collar that she hand-filed over 2 nights until it turned without a single whisper of friction. Each file stroke was precise. Each measurement was checked and rechecked. She wasn't building a toy. She was building a weapon. And if it failed, if it jammed, if it malfunctioned in the moment it mattered most, men would die because of her mistake. The heat dispersion problem took her 3 more nights to solve. With 6 barrels instead of 1, each tube would fire only a fraction of the total rounds per cycle. This alone cut the peak heat generation by nearly half. But she did not trust calculations. She needed to feel it, to test it, to know in her hands that the balance was correct. By August 13th, she had solved the recoil problem. She took a bracket originally designed for wing-mounted Browning machine guns and reinforced it with a section of oak harvested from a broken propeller crate. Oak, a material that seemed wrong, that should not work, but that absorbed shock better than metal because it was living material, flexible, resilient. Small detail, huge effect. She repeated that phrase until it became a mantra. Small detail, huge effect. That was where battles turned. That was where men lived or died. By August 16th, the feed mechanism was complete. A belt that rotated at exactly a 3-degree offset, no more, no less. She had discovered this through 30 variations of trial and error. Less than 3 degrees and it jammed. More than 3 degrees and it tore. 3 degrees. Another invisible measurement. Another detail that almost no one would ever notice. But that detail would decide whether 7 German bombers fell or 7 British crews died. By August 17th at dawn, the weapon was complete. 20 kilograms of steel, oak, bicycle parts, and engineering genius. She lifted it in her arms and nearly cried from relief. She had done it. She had built something that should not have existed, something that violated every protocol, every regulation, every assumption about what a woman mechanic could accomplish. And she had done it in secret. She smuggled it to the anti-aircraft pit on the evening of August 17th and hid it under a tarp, waiting for a chance that no one believed would ever come. The chance arrived faster than she expected. August 17th, 1940. 6:50 in the morning. Radar near Forneth had detected a formation of nearly 60 Luftwaffe aircraft heading toward the London defense zone. The signal came through crackling and urgent. It was the first unmistakable sign that the hardest day was approaching, the day that would determine whether the RAF could hold the line or whether England would be conquered from the sky. The base commander at Northweald issued readiness alerts. Every gun crew scrambled to stations. Every pilot was briefed on the incoming formation. Every technician was assigned a critical task. The word moved through the base like electricity through wire. Prepare for the heaviest assault yet. Elizabeth Carter knew what this meant. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when her weapon would either prove itself or remain a secret buried beneath a tarp, forgotten as soon as the war moved on to other bases, other crises, other impossible problems. She could not hide it any longer. She could not wait for official approval that would never come. She could not sit in the hangar and watch the guns jam while men died. The mathematics were against her. The odds were impossible. But she had long ago stopped caring about odds. She walked through the base toward the command bunker, moving with purpose, her uniform still stained with machine oil and metal dust from the previous night's work. The weapon would need to be tested, proven, not for her own benefit. She already knew it worked. She had felt it in her hands. She had heard it in the smooth rotation of the barrels. She had calculated every variable and confirmed every measurement. But the men who made decisions, the officers in their bunkers, the engineers who controlled funding and authorization, they would need proof that existed outside of her certainty. Within the hour, authorization had been arranged. A range slot at Shoeburyness had been cleared. Range officers had been notified. A staff car was waiting. Her weapon was secured in the back, carefully, as if it were already recognized as something precious.
The range test at Shoeburyness was still wrapped in a cold gray haze when she arrived, the kind of dawn light that flattened every shape into silhouette and made distances impossible to judge. Waves slapped against the concrete seawall with a slow, rhythmic pulse. The wind carried the metallic echo of distant artillery drills and the sharp smell of salt, cordite, and burned oil. Technicians stood beside range markers with clipboards ready. An officer checked his pocket watch twice. No one there knew what they were about to witness. They only knew that someone from Fighter Command had demanded an evaluation, and they had been ordered to conduct it. Elizabeth Carter stepped out onto the range at 6:13, carrying her prototype under her arm. 20 kilograms of steel, oak, and stubbornness. The officers stared. Their skepticism was visible in the tilt of their heads, the narrowing of their eyes. A woman carrying a weapon that looked like something assembled from scrap metal in a corner of a hangar. She set the weapon on the firing stand and tightened the recoil brace with methodical precision. Each movement was deliberate. Each adjustment was exact. She checked her ammunition belt one final time, running her fingers along each link, feeling for the slightest imperfection that could cause a jam. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. At 6:14, she spun the barrel cluster once by hand. The sound was clean, frictionless. The rotation was so smooth that one of the officers actually blinked, as if he had expected something crude, something that rattled and sputtered. When she released the barrels, they coasted for nearly a full second before stopping. No vibration, no hitch, no scraping. Precision that should not have been possible with materials scavenged from damaged aircraft. The testing protocol was read aloud. 3 phases: rotation without ammunition, slow fire, full output. Carter adjusted the elevation wheel with her free hand, making infinitesimal corrections to the firing angle. She gripped the crank and waited. At 6:16, the first rotation test began. She spun the crank. The barrels turned faster, faster, then stabilized into a perfect rotational hum, a sound like the supercharger of a Merlin engine ramping up to full power. Technicians checked vibration gauges. Readings stayed within acceptable tolerance. The rotation speed exceeded expectations by nearly 100%. At 6:17, Phase 2 began. She loaded the belt and locked it at exactly 3 degrees, the angle she had discovered through 30 variations of trial and error. She pulled the crank. The gun barked once, then twice, then roared into life. 10 rounds per second blasted through the barrels in a steady stream. Casings ejected with metronomic precision, striking the concrete in a rhythm so perfect it sounded mechanical, calculated, deliberate. No jams, no feed hesitation, no deviation. At 6:18, the heat gauges were pulled. Barrel temperatures averaged just above 200 degrees Celsius. The thermal load was being distributed exactly as she had predicted through weeks of calculation and nights of filing and fitting. At 6:19, the final test began. Full output, no time limit. Fire until failure. Carter spun the crank with every ounce of strength in her arms. The barrels blurred into a shimmering ring. The weapon thundered, blasting more than 1,000 rounds per minute into the armored target plate. Dust and metal shavings exploded into the air. The sound reverberated across the range like helicopter rotors at low altitude. She maintained the firing for nearly 2 full minutes. The barrels glowed along their seams, but never warped. The feed belt ran smoother than any belt-fed system they had tested all summer. The recoil brace groaned, but held firm. At 6:20, she released the crank. The weapon stopped, not from failure, but because she let it stop. The barrels kept spinning for nearly half a second after she stepped back. Still balanced, still alive, still refusing to behave like anything improvised. Silence fell across the range. One officer reached for the barrel cluster. Carter slapped his hand away with the authority of someone who had earned the right. The barrel was hot, dangerously hot, untouchably hot. That was not a failure. That was the price of power. At 6:21, the test sergeant read out the target data. Penetration patterns showed consistent grouping. Impact depth exceeded expectations by nearly 20%. Feed efficiency measured 98%. Jamming rate measured 0. 0 jams in more than 1,000 rounds. In 1940, that number alone decided whether men lived or died. The officers stood motionless, processing what they had just witnessed. A weapon that should not have existed had performed flawlessly. A design built in secret by a woman without authority had outperformed every gun on the RAF's inventory. Elizabeth Carter did not smile. She did not gloat. She only stared at the barrels the same way a mathematician stares at a formula finally proven true. She had done what everyone said was impossible. She had built something that worked. And only hours away she would discover whether it worked when German bombers filled the sky above Northweald.
By late afternoon on August 17th, the test results had reached Fighter Command headquarters. The reports were unambiguous. 0 jams, 98% feed efficiency, impact grouping that should not have been possible with a hand-built mechanism. A weapon designed and constructed by a single person using scrap materials had performed beyond specification. The response from headquarters came back in the form of a single encrypted message. Deploy the weapon to Northweald. Immediate operational status. Elizabeth Carter did not receive this message directly. It filtered down through command channels, through Group Captain Ellison's office, through engineering staff who were still struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed on the test range. By the time she learned that her weapon had been officially authorized for combat use, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and the Luftwaffe was preparing its final assault of the day. She was escorted back to Northweald in the same staff car that had brought her to Shoeburyness. The drive back was silent. The radio crackled with operational updates. RAF squadrons were being scrambled. Spitfires and Hurricanes were being vectored toward incoming formations. The air war was already reaching its crescendo before the sun set. When she arrived at the base, everything had changed. The weapon was no longer a secret. Engineers and technicians who had dismissed her weeks earlier now hovered near her as if she had suddenly become someone worth understanding. Her prototype was being photographed. Measurements were being taken. Officers were discussing deployment options, firing positions, ammunition allocation. She moved through all of it with a kind of detached awareness. This was no longer about her. It was about whether the weapon would perform when it mattered. It was about whether 700 rounds per minute of sustained fire could stop a dive bomber in its descent. It was about whether the mathematics of rotation and feed tension and heat dispersion would translate from the controlled environment of a test range into the chaos of an actual bombing raid. The night of August 17th stretched long. She was given quarters in the officers' barracks, a small gesture acknowledging that she was no longer simply a mechanic, but someone who had changed the equation of the battle. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkened room and reviewed every calculation in her mind, every tolerance, every alignment, every detail that could possibly fail. At 3 in the morning, She rose and walked to the hangar where her weapon was being stored. A guard still watched. He recognized her and stepped aside without question. She approached the weapon the way a surgeon approaches a patient before a critical operation. The barrels were still warm from the firing at Shoeburyness. She placed her palm against the metal and felt the residual heat. She checked the feed mechanism. The alignment was still perfect. She verified that the ammunition belts had been loaded correctly, each round positioned precisely, with no burrs, no deformations, nothing that could cause a jam. She spun the barrels with her hand. The rotation was flawless. The balance was perfect. Everything was exactly as she had designed it. Everything was ready. She did not pray. She was not a person who believed that prayer would change the outcome of mechanical systems. But she did something close to prayer. She whispered to the metal, to the components she had filed and fitted and balanced through weeks of work. She whispered the same phrase over and over. Hold true, hold true, hold true. By dawn on August 18th, the weapon had been moved to the anti-aircraft pit on the southwest corner of Northweald. The pit itself had been modified to accommodate the weapon's unique design. The firing stand had been reinforced. The ammunition storage had been reorganized. The targeting information had been updated to include the weapon's specifications. Elizabeth Carter stood in the pit as the first light of day broke across the airfield. Around her, ground crews moved with the particular urgency of men who know that the heaviest attack is coming. The weather reports predicted clear skies. The radar had detected German formations assembling across the channel. The mathematics were simple and terrible. The Germans would come today. They would come in force. They would come with the intention of destroying RAF Northweald. The only variable in the equation was what would happen when they arrived. At 4 a.m, the base commander ordered all combat personnel to their stations. Pilots moved toward the dispersal areas where their aircraft waited. Anti-aircraft crews checked their ammunition. Officers moved between positions, verifying readiness, checking communications, ensuring that every piece of the defensive apparatus was functioning correctly. Elizabeth Carter remained in the anti-aircraft pit with her weapon. A corporal had been assigned to assist her, a young man who had watched the gun drills for weeks and understood the mechanics of rotation and firing angles. He looked at her with something between awe and fear. He had heard the rumors. He knew that this woman had built something that might actually work, that it might actually save lives, that it might actually change the outcome of the battle that was about to unfold above their heads. She checked the weapon one final time. Every detail verified, every measurement confirmed. The barrels spun with their characteristic hum. The feed mechanism moved without hesitation. The recoil brace was secure. The ammunition belts were loaded and aligned. By 5 a.m, the sky was beginning to lighten. The stars were fading. The eastern horizon was shifting from black to dark blue to the pale gray of pre-dawn. The birds had fallen silent. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for what was coming. Elizabeth Carter stood beside her weapon and waited. At 5:30 a.m, radar detected the first formations assembling across the channel. More than 100 aircraft, the biggest raid yet, the attack that the Luftwaffe had been planning since the start of the Battle of Britain.
At 5:40, the observation posts reported the formations beginning their climb. German pilots were adjusting altitude, preparing for their dive runs. Fighter escorts were taking position above the bombers, forming the protective shield that had kept the Luftwaffe's strike aircraft alive through weeks of combat. At 5:42, the first sound came across the water, distant at first, then clearer, the rising scream of the Jericho trumpets. The mechanical sirens bolted onto the wings of the Stukas, engineered to freeze every living thing beneath them with pure terror. Elizabeth Carter felt the vibration before she heard the sound. It moved through the concrete of the anti-aircraft bed. It resonated in the metal of her weapon. It traveled through her body like a message written in oscillation and fear. She gripped the crank. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. Every week of preparation, every night of filing, every calculation, every test had led to this moment. Not the moment she had hoped for, not the moment she had planned for in abstract terms, but the real moment. The moment when mathematics met physics, when theory met practice, when a weapon would either save lives or prove that she had been wrong all along. The shadows of the first wave appeared on the horizon. She spun the barrels with her hand one final time. Smooth, perfect, ready. The German bombers were coming. The battle was beginning, and Elizabeth Carter was ready to prove that sometimes the smallest details decide the largest outcomes.
Elizabeth Carter stood in the Southwest Anti-Aircraft Pit as the morning of August 18, 1940, crossed the invisible line between anticipation and impact. The air above RAF Northweald vibrated with the distant approach of engines still beyond visual range, a low-frequency tremor that passed first through concrete, then through steel, then through bone. The sky was a flat, colorless gray, the kind that made altitude impossible to judge and distances impossible to trust. Somewhere beyond that horizon, more than 20 German bombers and their escorts were locking into formation, each one carrying enough explosive force to erase hangars, fuel depots, and control towers in a matter of minutes. For weeks, Northweald had been categorized as vulnerable. Its defensive profile was built on guns that jammed with catastrophic consistency. Crews had grown accustomed to the sickening rhythm of malfunction. The initial bursts, the sudden silence, the frantic clearing of feed arms while enemy aircraft rolled into their dives. Men had died inside that pattern. Hangars had burned because of it. Every jam had been a failure recorded not in reports, but in wreckage and graves. On this morning, the pattern was about to be tested against something new. A 20-kilogram machine built in the margins of official work, assembled from hydraulic tubing, scavenged metal, and a precise hatred for tolerances that did not hold under fire. The Carter multi-barrel system sat on its reinforced stand, its 6 barrels aligned around a central axis, its feed mechanism locked at a 3-degree offset. Ammunition belts waited coiled beside it like metallic serpents, each round hand-cleaned and inspected to remove the tiny imperfections that could become fatal when multiplied by rotation and speed. The first bombs fell at the perimeter fuel depot at 6:16 a.m. The blast rolled across the airfield in a sheet of pressure, lifting dust, grit, and fragments of concrete into the air. Windows in Hangar 2 shattered outward. Half-assembled Hurricanes shuddered on their jacks, their aluminum skins trembling like animals sensing a predator's teeth. Sirens wailed across the base. Standard guns opened fire, their reports chopped and uneven, the sound of human fear trying to keep pace with mechanical unreliability. In the Southwest Pit, the usual failure modes began to appear with grim predictability. One conventional gun dropped out with a jam in the feed arm. Another misfired and went silent as crews bent over its breech, hands working with the desperate haste of men who knew they were temporarily blind. The defensive grid that had been designed on paper was fracturing in reality. Angles of fire were opening in the air where enemy aircraft could pass unchallenged. It was into that widening gap that Carter's weapon was brought fully to life. She locked the recoil brace against the emplacement. She steadied her stance on the pit floor, boots braced against the recoil path she knew by feel rather than by theory. Above her, Heinkel bombers were crossing into their bombing runs at less than 4,000 feet, engines pushing them forward at more than 200 miles per hour. Their bomb bay doors were already opening. They had been briefed that Northweald's guns jammed. Their flight profile assumed ragged defensive fire and exploitable intervals of silence. The first rotation came not as a flourish, but as a controlled escalation. Carter spun the crank and brought the barrels from stillness to motion in a smooth, accelerating arc. The familiar hum returned. The same sound that had filled the test range at Shoeburyness, but this time it was layered beneath the rising thunder of approaching aircraft and the concussive thumps of bombs landing along the perimeter. When she fed the first belt into the mechanism and allowed the system to cross the boundary between rotation and firing, the weapon changed the acoustic landscape of the pit completely. 10 rounds per second left the barrels in a continuous stream of controlled violence. Tracer fire stitched a visible path into the gray sky, climbing toward the German formation with mechanical precision. Casings slammed into the concrete floor in an overlapping rhythm, a hard metallic rain marking the conversion of theory into action. The weapon did not hesitate. It did not stutter. It did not pause to consider that it had been built by one person in the off hours of a maintenance shift. The first Heinkel to cross her firing line did so under the assumption that this sector was low risk. Intelligence reports had classified the southwest pit as unreliable due to repeated jamming. Its crew had flown this route before and survived it. They banked slightly to adjust their dive angle and flew directly into the converging trajectory of Carter's tracers. Impacts walked across the left engine cowling in a line of incandescent strikes. A fraction of a second later, ruptured oil lines and structural damage translated those impacts into failure. The bomber dropped out of formation, trailing black smoke, then hit the ground beyond the ridge and detonated in a rolling sphere of flame. 1 kill. Not a projected outcome, not a theoretical performance. A physical absence in the German formation where an aircraft had existed seconds before. The temperature in the barrels began to climb. Under ordinary circumstances, heat buildup at that rate would have forced a pause, but this was the specific problem her design had been built to answer. 6 barrels sharing thermal load, a rotational sequence that allowed each 2 microseconds of cooling between bursts. She read the state of the metal through vibration, through resistance at the crank, through changes in tone. It was hot, but it was still within the zone she had mapped in her head on sleepless nights in the engine shed. The Luftwaffe adjusted. Fighters peeled away from their escort grid to run suppression passes over the pit. A Messerschmitt dived toward her position, cannon fire chewing into the ground around the emplacement. Dirt erupted in bursts along the revetment walls, the air filled with grit and concrete dust. Where a conventional crew might have broken rhythm to take cover, Carter folded incoming fire into her calculations. The weapon's traverse allowed rapid lateral correction. Its rotational mass resisted sudden deviations but rewarded smooth, continuous changes. The fighter crossed her modified firing arc at the precise instant when rotation, elevation, and lead intersected. Impacts tore into the undersurface of its wing, transferring damage into structural failure. The aircraft began to disintegrate under its own aerodynamic load, spiraling groundward in a trail of vapor and debris. A second absence appeared in the sky, where a hostile aircraft had existed seconds before. The battle compressed into fragments of time, measured not in minutes, but in sequences of bursts. Bombers passed overhead, released their payloads, and either survived their runs or did not. Some escaped her field of fire entirely, dropping bombs that shattered concrete and twisted metal, but failed to break the airfield's core functions. Others intersected the invisible volumes of space where her calculations and instincts overlapped. In those spaces, her weapon translated mathematics into destruction. The count rose. 3, 4, 5. Each downed aircraft was not just a tactical success, but an avoided catastrophe. Every bomber that broke apart before releasing its full load represented hangars that would not burn, fuel dumps that would not ignite, crews that would live through the morning. Every fighter that failed to complete a suppression run meant more seconds of uninterrupted defensive fire for the rest of the grid. By the time the 14th minute of sustained engagement passed, 7 German aircraft had been removed from the sky by a single weapon in a single pit. The Carter gun had cycled more than 1,000 rounds without a single jam. The barrels glowed along their lengths but remained structurally sound. The feed mechanism held its alignment despite recoil and heat and the cumulative stress of continuous operation. The recoil brace absorbed and redistributed force along the path she had anticipated when she reinforced it with wood instead of relying solely on metal. Around her, the shape of the battle altered. The German formation, once tight and disciplined, showed visible gaps. Bombing runs were disrupted. Dive profiles were abandoned mid-sequence as crews reacted to unexpected losses. A base previously classified as vulnerable had, in a matter of minutes, shifted categories in the mind of the attacker, from exploitable target to statistically lethal environment. The Luftwaffe's tolerance for loss had been exceeded by a system they had not known existed when they planned their approach. When the last aircraft within her effective range either fell or broke away, Carter allowed the weapon to wind down. She eased off the crank and stepped back, muscles trembling from exertion, arms deadened by recoil and repeated movement. The barrels continued to spin under their own inertia for a final half-second before the cluster settled into stillness. The pit was suddenly, unnaturally quiet, the silence only broken by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sounds of fires being fought at the edges of the field. In those 14 minutes, the anti-aircraft profile of RAF Northweald had been rewritten by something none of the official manuals had accounted for. A single mechanic who refused to accept that 2 millimeters of misalignment and a few degrees of feed error were unchangeable facts of war.
With the last echo of gunfire fading into the morning haze, RAF Northweald entered a kind of stunned, uneven silence. Not the calm that follows victory, and not the hollow quiet of defeat, but something in between, a pause in which hundreds of men tried to reconcile what they had just seen with what they believed was possible. Columns of black smoke rose from the wrecks of German aircraft scattered beyond the perimeter, each plume a vertical scar carved into the pale August sky. In less than 15 minutes, one unauthorized weapon in a single gun pit had done what 3 fully staffed anti-aircraft positions had failed to achieve for weeks. 7 German aircraft destroyed, a full bombing run disrupted, an airfield that should, statistically, have been shredded by ordnance still standing, with most of its critical infrastructure intact. For the first time in nearly a month, no hangar had burned to the ground. Fire crews were fighting blazes, but they were localized, containable, survivable. Damage assessment teams moved out across the base with clipboards and casualty lists that suddenly seemed miscalibrated. Projections compiled before the raid had assumed that a certain percentage of bomb loads would fall on target. Under any normal configuration, close to 10 tons of explosives should have landed across the airfield's most vulnerable assets: fuel, aircraft, control, and communication nodes. The predicted casualty figures had started around 40 and climbed upward from there. The actual numbers told a different story. Fuel stores were damaged, but not annihilated. The control tower had suffered a partial power loss, but remained structurally sound. 9 Hurricanes were still serviceable. 3 more could be brought back with heavy repairs. The final casualty count, though painful, remained under a dozen. 7 bombers had never released their payloads at all, because 7 bombers had ceased to exist before they reached their release points. Word of what had happened in the southwest pit spread across Northweald with a speed that formal communication could not match. Armorers, fitters, riggers, pilots, and clerks all carried fragments of the same story. The scrap-built 6-barrel gun that did not jam, the woman mechanic who had held her position under suppression fire, the tracers that seemed to carve holes in a formation everyone had assumed would pass through relatively unchallenged. Engineers converged on the weapon as soon as it was declared safe to approach. They knelt beside the spent casings scattered across the pit floor, lifting them one by one as if handling physical evidence from an impossible experiment.
Ejection was clean. Case walls showed no deformities, no irregular burn traces, no signs of feed stress. Impact data from the wrecks confirmed consistent spacing between hits, a pattern that pointed not to luck or fluke alignment, but to stable rotational harmonics and a precisely controlled feed path. What looked like improvisation from a distance revealed itself up close as engineering discipline disguised in salvaged metal. Heat dispersion across the barrels turned out to be more even than observed on factory-produced guns after comparable firing durations. The rotational collar exhibited uniform wear instead of localized strain. The feed arm, the critical weak point in the older systems, had maintained its alignment despite sustained output well beyond the conservative thresholds most designers would have accepted. Beyond the empirical data, something less measurable was shifting in the atmosphere of the base. Morale, which had been eroded by weeks of exhaustion, loss, and the repeated failure of existing systems, began to tilt back toward a kind of cautious confidence. Crews who had learned to work in a permanent state of dread now had a counterexample. A morning when the mathematics of survival had suddenly improved because one person had refused to treat malfunction as inevitable. Radar plots later that morning recorded a second Luftwaffe formation forming 40 miles out. The pattern suggested a follow-up raid, a continuation of the pressure that had defined the last phase of the Battle of Britain. But the attackers did not commit. Fighters circled, evaluated, and then turned back toward the continent. Analysts who reviewed the data afterward concluded that real-time loss calculations on the German side had triggered a reassessment. A target previously labeled soft had abruptly crossed the threshold into unacceptable risk. Inside Northweald's operations rooms and briefing huts, the numbers were collated and abstracted into reports: kill ratios, rounds expended, structural damage, sortie readiness, projected timelines for repair. Hidden between those lines was a singular fact the paperwork struggled to accommodate: that the decisive variable in the morning's survival had neither been a new directive from above nor a scheduled deployment of official equipment, but a mechanism conceived, built, and refined outside the established channels by someone the institution had not been designed to recognize. In the anti-aircraft pit, as teams began preparing the weapon for inspection and documentation, the barrels continued to tick faintly as they cooled. The metal bore the faint, evenly distributed discoloration of controlled stress rather than catastrophe. The weapon had been pushed to the edge of what it could endure and had come back intact, carrying with it physical proof of an idea that had started as a set of irritated notes in a grease-stained notebook, that small, precise corrections, applied relentlessly, could shift the outcome of a war measured in thousands of sorties and millions of rounds. For RAF Northweald, August 18th would later be recorded in official histories as another hard day in the Battle of Britain, one engagement among many. For the people who had stood on that airfield and watched 7 enemy aircraft fall to a gun they had dismissed as a curiosity, it was something else, a demonstration that the front line was not only in the sky, but also in the minds and hands of those who refused to treat good enough as the limit imposed by rank, tradition, or expectation.
After the smoke began to thin over Northweald, the story of what had happened in the southwest pit started to move upward through the hierarchy, translated from shock and eyewitness fragments into the colder language of staff meetings, reports, and classified signals. By early morning, the event had already split into 2 parallel realities. On the ground, crews talked in visceral terms: the sound of the rotating barrels, the impossible steadiness of the fire, the way bombers that once seemed untouchable now visibly flinched under concentrated streams of tracers. In offices and briefing huts, the same events were being converted into columns of numbers and terse summaries. 7 confirmed kills, 0 jams, feed integrity at 98%, barrel deformation below acceptable thresholds despite sustained output. The anomaly was too large to ignore. The defensive performance of a single improvised system had exceeded that of officially sanctioned guns by a factor measured not in percentages but in multiples. The institution now had to decide what to do with this uncomfortable fact. On one side lay imitation and integration. Study the mechanism, reproduce it, deploy it to other bases marked as high-risk targets. On the other lay containment. Classify, restrict, minimize the disruptive implications of a weapon that did not originate in any authorized design bureau. The first response came in the form of technical scrutiny. Engineers disassembled the weapon under Carter's supervision piece by piece, documenting dimensions, tolerances, and wear patterns. They found no miracles and no shortcuts, only precision where they would have expected compromise, and margins that had been calculated rather than guessed. The 6 barrels showed evenly distributed heat stress, less severe than that observed on standard guns after shorter engagements. The rotational collar had worn uniformly, proof that alignment had been achieved by method rather than luck. The feed assembly, the point of failure in so many existing systems, had held its geometry through shock and temperature cycles that should have shaken a weaker design apart. Parallel to this, a different kind of assessment unfolded, one focused not on metal and tolerances, but on perception and control. A weapon built in defiance of protocol by a mechanic outside the traditional chain of innovation posed a challenge to more than just engineering assumptions. It raised questions about authority, credit, and the narratives institutions prefer to tell about themselves. Acknowledging the system publicly would mean acknowledging that a critical breakthrough had not come from a committee, a department, or a directorate, but from someone who was expected to tighten bolts and follow instructions. The compromise that began to emerge was characteristically bureaucratic. The design would not be dismissed. It was too effective to ignore in a war where airfields could be erased in a single morning. Instead, it would be absorbed. Schematics would be drawn, refinements proposed, production plans drafted for deployment at selected stations along the vulnerable southeastern belt. At the same time, classification barriers would be raised. Documentation would be stamped, distribution limited, external acknowledgement deferred indefinitely under the familiar justification of operational security. For those working beside Carter in the days that followed, the shift was tangible. The woman who had spent nights working alone in an engine shed now found herself at the center of a small, unofficial school of practice. Technicians who had once laughed at her notebook now asked her to explain the logic of the 3-degree feed offset, the importance of filing contact surfaces until friction disappeared, the way vibration could serve as both warning and measurement if you knew how to interpret it. Chalk diagrams appeared on crates and walls, rough sketches of the mechanism's internals becoming teaching tools passed from one gun crew to another. Beyond the base, teleprinter messages began to carry a new phrase into planning documents. Multi-barrel rotary system, unregistered variant, demonstrated kill-to-round ratio significantly higher than existing QF 3-inch guns. The wording was careful, almost clinical, but the implications were not. High vulnerability stations, those that German planners had marked for repeated attack, were suddenly candidates for a weapon that had already proven it could shift the outcome of a raid in under a quarter of an hour. Inside that spreading web of reports and evaluations, one detail remained constant. The origin of the design was flattened into anonymity as it moved further from Northweald. The farther the idea traveled, the less space there was for the name of the person who had first refused to accept that regular jamming was simply part of the landscape of war. What persisted instead were the characteristics that the system imposed on battle. Fewer bombs on target, more attackers forced to break off, more defenders alive at the end of a morning that previously would have been measured in loss rather than survival. For Elizabeth Carter, the days after the raid were paradoxical. On the ground, surrounded by people who had seen the weapon in use, she was recognized in direct, practical ways, consulted, deferred to, asked to lead replication work and training.
In the documents climbing the chain, she became a function, a mechanic, unnamed or briefly noted, attached to an experimental system that would soon be described as though it had emerged from the institution itself. Between these two realities, she continued to do what she had done from the beginning: focus on the work, on the next refinement, on the next fraction of a millimeter that could be shaved, aligned, or corrected. The front line had not moved on any map, but it had shifted in a different sense. The events at Northweald had demonstrated that the space in which wars are decided is not confined to runways and sortie counts. It also exists in the quiet, unremarkable hours when someone refuses to accept that a known failure mode is permanent and instead sits down with metal, tools, and a stubborn belief that the world can be made to behave differently if you insist on precision where others have settled for probability.
Elizabeth Carter's life after the raid was marked by a quiet paradox. The weapon she had built, which had rewritten the defensive capabilities of RAF Northweald, became an institution's secret. It was classified, restricted, shielded by layers of official silence that buried the story beneath the daily demands of a war raging across continents. Recognition would have to wait, possibly indefinitely, as operational security became an impenetrable veil. She was transferred away from the front line, reassigned to a rear area engineering depot near Wolverhampton. The reason, delivered in clipped bureaucratic language, was clear. Her skills were needed in general engine production. The same hands that had designed a groundbreaking weapon would now work on the cooling systems and gearbox tolerances of standard aircraft engines, a domain far from the public eye and the drama of battle. This quiet reassignment was part of a broader pattern. In a military tradition marked by hierarchy and convention, innovations from outside established channels often arrived with complications. Behind every breakthrough lay concerns about maintaining order and authority, about controlling narratives, and about managing the implications of recognizing achievements in unexpected places. The name Elizabeth Carter would disappear from official histories, replaced by a collective acknowledgement of new rotary weapon designs and improved feed systems born from wartime necessity. The principles she had pioneered, however, did not vanish. By 1944, aspects of her feed assembly and multi-barrel design appeared in multiple anti-aircraft prototypes. The legacy was there in engineering offices, in test ranges, and in the continued air battles that defined the late war years. Yet, the link between the woman who built the original and the weapons that followed remained obscured, swallowed into the machinery of an institution that prized uniformity above individuality. After the war, Elizabeth Carter returned quietly to civilian life. She joined Rolls-Royce as a junior engineer, contributing to projects involving vibration management and gearbox tolerances. She married, raised children, and wove herself into the fabric of post-war Britain. When asked about the war, she would smile softly and say simply, "I fixed engines." The truth of her contribution, like the smallest mechanical alignments that determine so much, was known to few. Her story, buried under layers of classified documents and unspoken acknowledgments, embodies the paradox of wartime innovation, the tension between necessity and recognition, between invention and institution. It is a reminder that history's front lines are not only drawn in airfields and skies, but also in the quiet determination of individuals who refuse to accept the boundaries imposed by circumstance or tradition. Elizabeth Carter died in 1981 in a small cottage overlooking a river she loved. In her attic, her son later discovered a folder labeled simply "August Morning," a collection of faded manuals, old tools, sketches, and notes. Inside those pages lay the fragments of a story that had changed the course of a battle, though it almost never became history. If the history of the Battle of Britain is often told in terms of squadrons and generals, of fighters and bombers,
then Elizabeth Carter's story invites us to remember the mechanics, the quiet engineers and the observant women whose small details shaped the fate of nations in ways that official histories too often overlook. This concludes the core narrative of Elizabeth Carter and her secret multi-barrel rotary weapon that saved RAF Northweald during the Battle of Britain. Would you like help with an introduction, conclusion, or supplementary chapters? Or assistance preparing the script for production? Let me know.